Right now, millions of people are preparing for what they genuinely believe is the most important Sunday of the year. They're buying chips in bulk, they're texting group chats about dip recipes, they're stress shopping for a TV they can't afford because the big game deserves it, and somewhere in that same exact moment, there's someone scrolling past all of it with the same blank expression you'd have if someone tried to convince you that competitive cheese rolling was about to be the event of the century. Not annoyed, not superior, just completely, utterly unmoved. And what's wild is that this person isn't broken. They're not missing some critical piece of the human experience. Their brain just works differently when it comes to watching other people throw a ball around for 3 hours. And the reasons why are way more interesting than you'd think. If you're sticking around to figure out why some brains just refuse to care about football, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. You're in the right place. So let's start here. Caring about sports is not hardwired into your DNA. I know that sounds obvious, but you'd be surprised how many people act like there's something fundamentally wrong with you if the Super Bowl doesn't make your heart race. The truth is, what happens in your brain when you watch your team win is actually a fascinating cocktail of psychological phenomena that some people just don't experience the same way. There's this thing called basking in reflected glory, which is exactly what it sounds like. When your team wins, your brain releases dopamine like you personally had something to do with it. You didn't train, you didn't strategize, you didn't catch a single pass. You sat on furniture and yelled at a screen. But your brain doesn't care about those minor details. It gives you a genuine chemical reward for being emotionally attached to the right group of strangers wearing the right color jerseys. For people who don't care about the Super Bowl, that mechanism either doesn't trigger as strongly or it triggers for completely different things. Maybe their brain saves that dopamine hit for finishing a book, or landing a difficult recipe, or finally beating that one level in a video game they've been stuck on for 2 weeks. Here's where it gets interesting. The Journal of Consumer Psychology published research showing that people have drastically different optimal stimulation levels. Some nervous systems crave high-intensity, emotionally volatile experiences. The ups, the downs, the last-minute field goals, the devastating interceptions, that's entertainment. But other brains find that exact same intensity genuinely uncomfortable. Not boring, not intellectually beneath them, just neurologically unpleasant. It's the same reason some people love roller coasters and others would rather eat glass than get on one. Different wiring, different preferences. When someone tells you they don't care about the Super Bowl, there's a decent chance their brain prefers lower intensity experiences. 3 hours of manufactured tension with constant momentum swings might feel less like fun and more like being trapped in an emotional blender. And that's not a character flaw, that's just how their nervous system operates. And then there's the whole tribal aspect. Humans survived as a species because we formed tight-knit groups and competed with other groups for resources. Sports are basically that ancient instinct dressed up in modern clothing. When people scream, "We won," they're tapping into the same primal in-group versus out-group dynamics that kept our ancestors alive. But here's the thing, not everyone feels that pull with the same intensity. Some people get their sense of belonging in book clubs. Others find community in niche Reddit threads about mechanical keyboards or vintage synthesizers, or literally anything that doesn't require memorizing quarterback statistics. They're not rejecting community, they've just built it in spaces where the stakes feel more personally meaningful. Let's talk about locus of control for a second, because this one's crucial. In psychology, there's this concept that describes whether you focus your energy on things you can influence or things completely outside your control. Think about what you're actually doing when you watch a football game. You're wearing lucky socks, you're sitting in a specific chair, you're maybe even doing some sort of superstitious ritual because last time you did it, your team won. But none of that changes what happens on the field, literally 0% of it. For some people, that's totally fine. The emotional journey is the whole point. But for others, that feels fundamentally unsatisfying. They'd rather spend their emotional energy on things where effort creates a direct, measurable outcome. Neither approach is better, they're just different ways of interacting with the world. Now let's address something nobody seems to want to talk about: overstimulation. Modern life is already a constant barrage of notifications, texts, emails, breaking news alerts, social media chaos, and like 17 different apps trying to convince you that you're missing out on something critical. For a lot of people, the Super Bowl is just another thing demanding their attention and emotional bandwidth. And frankly, they're maxed out. especially for people who psychologists classify as highly sensitive, which is apparently about 20% of the population. Super Bowl parties are basically 3-hour sensory endurance tests. The noise, the crowds, the commercials screaming at you, the constant stimulation. What feels like a celebration for some people feels like an exhausting ordeal for others. And then they're supposed to go to work the next day and pretend they had a great time. There's also this fascinating variance in how people handle uncertainty. Research shows that humans have wildly different tolerance levels for unpredictability and ambiguity. Sports are fundamentally uncertain, right? That's supposed to be the thrill. You never know what's going to happen. Anything could change in the final 2 minutes. But for people with lower uncertainty tolerance, that same unpredictability doesn't register as exciting. It registers as stress. They're not enjoying the suspense. They're just uncomfortable the whole time, waiting for it to be over. And when you combine that discomfort with the fact that the outcome has literally zero impact on your actual life, sitting through 3 hours of voluntary anxiety starts to seem less appealing. And then there's the whole cultural production aspect of it all. The Super Bowl stopped being just a football game decades ago. Now it's this massive spectacle with commercials people analyze like they're Shakespearean texts, halftime shows that cost more than small countries' GDP, themed food that nobody actually likes but everyone pretends to care about. If you're not into football, all that extra hype just makes the whole thing feel even more alienating. You're surrounded by people getting worked up over ads and making a big deal about whether the nachos are authentic, and you're just sitting there thinking, this is so much effort for something I genuinely do not understand. It's not just boring, it's isolating in a way that's hard to articulate. You start to feel like the only person in the room who didn't get the memo, and that disconnect is uncomfortable in its own right. But sometimes there's no deep psychological explanation at all. Sometimes people just don't like football the same way some people don't like cilantro or jazz or pineapple on pizza. We've become so obsessed with pathologizing every single difference that we forget humans just have different tastes. The person who doesn't care about the Super Bowl might be deeply, passionately invested in Formula One racing or Olympic figure skating or competitive Scrabble, and that preference doesn't need a neurological justification to be valid. What I find most fascinating is how uncomfortable it makes people when someone says they don't care about the Super Bowl. There's this immediate defensiveness, like you've personally insulted their entire family, and that reaction tells you everything about how sports function as identity markers. When you reject the Super Bowl, some people hear it as rejecting them, their values, their entire way of life. It's not actually about the game, it's about belonging and shared experience, and maybe some deep anxiety that if too many people opt out, the whole thing loses its cultural significance. So if you're someone who doesn't care about the Super Bowl, there's probably a combination of factors at play. Maybe your optimal stimulation level runs lower. Maybe you prefer investing energy in things you can directly control. Maybe you're just not wired to get excited about competitive sports. Maybe the manufactured spectacle feels exhausting. Maybe uncertainty registers as stress instead of entertainment. Or maybe you just find it boring and that's the entire explanation. All of those are completely legitimate ways to exist as a human being. And if you're someone who lives for the Super Bowl, that's equally valid. The world doesn't require everyone to experience things the same way. And honestly, that's probably the only reason society hasn't completely collapsed. You can have millions of people losing their minds over a football game, while millions of others are perfectly content doing literally anything else. And somehow we all manage to coexist. Different brains, different preferences, same planet. Alright, that's it. If you're someone who doesn't care about the Super Bowl, drop a comment and tell me what you're doing instead this Sunday. Reading, gaming, finally organizing that closet, staring at a wall in peaceful silence? I genuinely want to know. And if you're one of the football people, no judgment, tell me what makes it so compelling for you. I'm curious. Either way, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.